Chapter 8. Is Blackguard at Work? It was nearly dawn when Plucky and Rune arrived at the meeting place with the horde of animals who followed them. Jeremy, Damaris, and a few of the children were already there. The others arrived 2 or 3 at a time during the next hour. The sun yawned and began to stretch its rays over the hill. Watching it, Jeremy began to realize in earnest that all of this was real and not just a dream. His stomach felt tied in knots. Here he was, the commander of a huge and still growing army, and he was only 12 years old. Plucky introduced Jeremy to Rune, and after a brief discussion, Jeremy put Rune in command of the animal army. When all the children were there, they took up their march, heading even deeper into the woods, Plucky leading the way. Behind them came an amusing sight, animals of every description and size. Rune led them, and it was quite a job for him to hold them back. Most of the animals could have gone much faster than the children. As they came to a large fallen tree, probably the same one that Judd had fallen over, who should be waiting for them but Minnikin? There he stood in the middle of the road with his hands on his hips and his miniature sword in its scabbard at his side. "Minnikin at your service, and ready for battle." The army halted. Jeremy stood there puzzled. Plucky quickly spoke up. "I know of Minnikin. He is a true friend of the king." "Oh-ho!" laughed Minnikin, looking down at the squirrel. "The beasts are talking these days, are they?" "Not all," explained Jeremy. "Only Plucky and Rune. You are welcome to come with us if you serve the king of Altura," he continued. "I would serve no other," Minnikin said. Without another word, he fell in step with Jeremy and Damaris. The army continued on its way. As they marched along, Minnikin told Jeremy and Damaris of the Dwarf Wars. They had heard about them because their father had boasted of the victory. He told them how some of the dwarves had escaped. "Anyone who is an enemy of Pernicious is a friend of mine," Minnikin said, "and no doubt if Blackguard is in on this scheme, I'll not survive to tell my story again. But then, if I don't take sides against him, my story won't be worth telling, if you get my drift." "How did you know about us, though?" asked Jeremy, who thought their plans had been so secret. "Well, first off, there was Judd. Then there was all that action last night. I stayed out of sight and listened, making sure all of this was on the level, you know. I had been keeping an eye on you all along the path this morning, listening real quiet-like. And to tell you straight, you kids inspired me. It's like I said, us dwarves have no one to fear more than the wizard, but I just can't go on hiding forever." Minnikin thought of the days when the dwarves were a peaceful and independent race. They were always proud of their ancestry, and no one could match their skills at mining or their craftsmanship in metals. He had nothing to practice now, hiding in the woods. Live or die, he would do what he could for the cause of rightness and the memory of his people. Others must have survived, he thought, but he didn't know where they might be. Most likely they were all hiding out somewhere, afraid to make themselves known. "Shall we ever be restored?" he asked himself. "Maybe I am the last. Please don't let that be. Ah, for the mines and the foundries." The army came to the foot of the mountain, and Jeremy turned toward the path that would lead them around. Plucky stopped him, though, and pointed in the direction of the cave. Jeremy knew what Plucky meant when he saw him pointing. "All right, Plucky, good. Here's where we save our time." Plucky took the lead then and went running on ahead of the rest. The others followed, trying hard to keep up, just barely managing to keep him in sight. When they reached the clearing, Plucky was waiting for them, but he looked rather confused. "What's wrong, Plucky?" asked Damaris. I can't find it," Plucky mused. "It isn't there." "What's not there?" asked Jeremy. "The cave. You know, the tunnel through the mountain," said Plucky. "See that clearing and that cliff? It should be right there, but it isn't. It's just not there." "Was there an avalanche?" asked Damaris. No avalanche. It looks as if there never was a cave, but I took Judd through it just yesterday, and I came back that way last night," Plucky insisted. "I knew there was something weird about that little squirrel," Danbury, one of the older boys, muttered. "I told Jeremy not to trust him," piped up little Geoffrey. Jeremy overheard them, and, discouraged, he walked away from the others and leaned against a tree. "What's going on here?" he thought to himself. "I have gathered an army together and marched all this way on nothing more than the word of a squirrel. Now there isn't even a cave to go through, and we're at a dead end. Is anything he told us true?" But grandmother trusted him. Jeremy suddenly felt very, very young again. His thoughts were interrupted by Minnikin, who had come up silently and now stood by the tree waiting to be recognized. "What is it, Minnikin?" Jeremy asked. "Well, sir," said Minnikin solemnly, "there is no cave, but there is a path. It's just a small animal path, but it leads up to the base of the cliff and then stops right where Plucky says the tunnel should be." Rune, who had been standing nearby talking to Don Maurice and Plucky, overheard Minnikin's remark. "Pardon me," he said politely, "but I could not help overhearing you. I am beginning to think that this may be a trick of Blackguard the wizard. He wouldn't want King Azidor to get any help, that's for sure. He could be trying to get us to turn back." "Well," said Jeremy, "looks like we'll just have to go around the mountain then." "Maybe we could still get through the tunnel," Don Marie suggested. "We can't dig our way through that mountain," laughed the dwarf. "There may have been a cave there before, but there certainly isn't one there now, my lady." "But if it's a trick," Don Maurice went on, "things might not be as they seem. I think we should at least try something before we start off around the mountain. It is so much longer that way." "If only we had some tools for digging, I'd be willing to try," Jeremy said. Everyone was so deep in thought that no one noticed Plucky scampering away. Someone suggested that they might try going over the mountain, but Minnikin said he knew the mountain well, and that would take as long as going around, maybe longer. In a minute, Plucky was back, and with him were at least a dozen gophers and about half that many moles. Let them try, begged Plucky eagerly. "They want to try to dig through to the tunnel." Jeremy and Don Maurice looked at each other in utter amazement. They had forgotten all about the animals. "Well, it would take a lot of digging to make a hole big enough for Rune and the bears to go through. It would still be faster to go around if you ask me," said Minnikin. Perhaps it had something to do with his age, perhaps not, but he was quickly becoming the most doubtful one in the bunch. "There's one thing we must remember, though," said Rune carefully. "If we go around, we are sure to encounter the enemy before we get to the castle, and we have no weapons. Besides, we have no way of knowing how many of them there are. I think we should avoid going around the mountain if there is any other way." "I think I agree with you, Rune," said Jeremy. "Let the moles and gophers see what they can do. The others of us can rest for a bit. Very few of us slept at all last night, and I, for one, am exhausted." Plucky showed the moles and the gophers where to start digging, and they went to work swiftly and eagerly. It did look a bit strange, though, to see so many of them working all together, digging into the side of a mountain. In just a few short minutes, about the time it took everyone to get comfortable, one of the gophers broke through and tumbled into the mouth of the cave. Only seconds later, another did the same thing, and then another and another. When the fifth worker, a mole, rolled into the cave, a wall of dirt collapsed on them and buried at least half of all the workers. They all dug themselves out in less than a minute, though, since gophers and moles are right at home underground. Jeremy had way too many problems on his mind to be able to sleep. He had just found a place to rest his weary bones when Plucky came running up and jumped on his chest. "What is it, Plucky?" Jeremy asked in a startled voice. "We're ready to go! We're ready to go!" chattered Plucky. "What?" exclaimed Jeremy. "We broke through, and the whole front fell away," Plucky continued. "See, it was a trick after all. I knew there was a cave there." He could hardly believe what he was hearing, but when he ran over to see, Minnikin was already helping some beavers clear away the mound of dirt from the entrance. As he looked on amazed, a few children ran up and began to help scrape away the fallen dirt. When he realized that he was just standing there, staring, Jeremy jumped in and started to work as well. Soon the entrance was clear, and Plucky was bouncing up and down, running around, telling everyone to come and see. Rune walked over to Jeremy and quietly took him aside. "I'm sure this was Blackguard's doing, Captain Jeremy. I hope we have seen the last of it, but we must be wary. He is a very dangerous wizard." "Rune," said Jeremy sadly, "you may have noticed this isn't our only problem. The opening to the tunnel is too small. Even the children will have to enter on their hands and knees. You and the larger animals won't fit in at all. What shall we do?" "There's no time to enlarge the opening," said Rune. "That could take hours, maybe days. It seems as if the only thing we can do is go around the mountain or over it somehow." "But I must reach the king as soon as possible," said Jeremy. "I and the children will take the tunnel. I wouldn't be able to communicate with the smaller animals anyway, so you take all of them and hurry around the mountain as swiftly as you can. Or maybe over the mountain would be better. You decide. We can only hope that you come in time to help." Then Jeremy thought of what Grandmother had told him. "We must hope against hope," he said, more confidently than he felt inside. "You may be able to recruit more animals as you pass through the forest, but be careful of the enemy. They probably won't suspect what you are about, but they may harm you for the sport of it. I will take Plucky with me. I will need him to be a messenger. Good fortune to you, Rune. Take Grandmother's heart as you go." Everyone resumed their places in line and set out again. Rune gathered all the animals quickly and set off with them at once. Jeremy gave the children careful instructions about staying together. Each was told to hold on to the shirt of the one in front. He also had them grab limbs and pieces of unneeded clothing with which to make torches. This is where they made a costly mistake. It isn't always best to take our own light with us into darkness. Damaris approached her brother. "Isn't it grand, Jeremy, about the cave?" "Yes, we're fortunate," said Jeremy. "Are all the torches lit?" he shouted to Minnikin. "Yes, Captain," Minnikin shouted back. Rune decided to go over the mountain instead of around. By the time the children started into the cave, Rune and the animals were well on their way. His main concern at first was the different speeds at which the animals were able to travel. This hadn't been a problem before because they were behind the children and all the animals were faster than the children. Now, as he led the troop, he kept the smaller animals up in front to keep them in sight. Rune carried himself with confidence and humility. All the animals he met on the mountain joined immediately with the march. He wielded authority, yet it was gentle. The great golden horse led his menagerie along swiftly but cautiously. He had some idea of what he was up against in Blackguard. He was not immune to fear, but he didn't let it rule him. Rune concluded that it would take 8 hours to reach the castle at the pace they were traveling. A human on foot, you may remember, would not have arrived until sometime late the second day. Through the morning hours, Rune had time to think. What had happened to his stablemates? Where were they? Were they all alive yet? Did they understand what had happened through them? He determined that when this was all over, he would find the answers to those questions. By noon, they could see the summit of the mountain. They had taken odd and various paths to accommodate the different species, but soon the woods began to thin, and they reached a lush clearing. From there, they could see over the crest of the mountain and down the other side. Going down was not as steep, but Rune could tell that the distance was greater going down than it had been coming up. The company halted for a brief rest here on the mountain top. Soon the lumbering bears, who brought up the rear, came into the clearing, and Rune marveled at how the number of animals had grown. Their spirits were high. They united in their determination that no one would conquer their land and take their freedom. All for Altura! Then, without warning, came the fire. Fire, the fear of every animal, the only thing they feared more than men. It came seemingly from nowhere and from everywhere and spread rapidly in both directions. The fire was quickly working its way around the circle. Before Rune could say a word, panic struck. Every animal sprang forward and ran for the other side of the clearing. Smaller animals were brushed aside and nearly trampled. Rune reared, bellowing, trying to gain control. Before anyone reached the other side, fire sprang up there as well. It had not started to burn into the clearing yet, but the heat was becoming intense. The animals had nowhere to go. They ran in circles and backtracked. There was no escape. Rune, too, feared for his life. The whole forest, on every side, raged in flame and panic. Grandmother was lying in bed when the fever struck. Perspiration soaked her nightclothes and her bedding. Her head spun with dizziness. Struggling, she rolled over and dropped her feet to the floor. Weak with fever and swaying as she walked, grandmother left the house through the front door. Had Dawn-Marie's been there, she never would have let her out of bed. But now, trying desperately just to stay on her feet, she groped her way behind the house toward the nearby stream. She stumbled and fell. For a moment she was motionless, but then she lifted her head and saw that she was but a few paces from the stream. Could she rise? She struggled to one knee, then the other. A fair wind blew against her face, yet it did not cool her. She was burning up with fever. Finally, rising to her feet, she grasped a nearby sapling to steady herself. She took 2 extra long strides, and then the whole scene began to spin. She looked up toward the sun. It faded, and all went black. No one was there to hear the splash. The animals did not, of course, notice the clouds that had covered the sun and sky overhead. In their terror, only the sudden deafening clap of thunder and the following torrent of water from above was able to bring them back to their senses. They could barely withstand the force of the rain as it beat upon them. Steam began to rise on every side. The rain beat the fire into submission. Not as quickly as it had begun, but quicker than could naturally be expected, the fire died. Steam continued to rise from the hot ground as the rain ceased. The animals shook off the water and started to preen themselves. Rune's voice was sober. "My friends, somehow this smells of blackguard. At the very least he has attempted to scare us. He has succeeded in that, to be sure. Why the fire has gone out, I cannot say. It would be more like him to finish us. Perhaps there are other powers at work that we don't know of yet. Whatever the reasons, our danger and our mission are all the more clear. I am asking you to follow me now at any cost. Blackguard must at least think he has something to fear from us. Otherwise he would not bother. We can't stop now. Onward!" Rune turned and made haste toward the northeast slope. At first the others were reluctant, but they eventually followed, picking up speed as they went along.